Meet Veronica, the 2.0 version, Michael announced with a smug grin, his fingers intertwined with hers across our reserved table at Ciel. What my husband didn't know as he brought his mistress to our 10th anniversary dinner was that neither of them would be enjoying their new life after that night. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Those words hung in the air of the five-star restaurant, shattering the carefully planned anniversary celebration I'd spent weeks arranging. 10 years of marriage reduced to a cruel public announcement on what should have been our special night. The champagne I'd pre-ordered, a rare vintage that cost more than most people's monthly rent, was being uncorked by an uncomfortable waiter as my husband and his 20-something companion slid into the booth across from me. I watched them settle into their seats, Veronica's glossy chestnut hair catching the ambient lighting as she claimed what should have been my husband's place beside me. Her perfume, an expensive scent I recognized from a bottle that had appeared on our shared credit card statement 3 months ago, drifted across the table. Another gift he hadn't bothered to hide. Michael sat next to her, already reaching for the vintage champagne I'd selected, our traditional anniversary drink. The same champagne we'd had at our wedding, on our first anniversary in Paris, and every year since. His casual confidence was breathtaking. He truly believed he was in control of this situation, if only he knew what was coming. "I hope you don't mind that I brought Veronica," Michael said, though his tone made it clear he didn't care whether I minded or not. "I thought it would be more efficient this way." Efficient. Such a Michael word. Always optimizing, always calculating. It was what had made him so successful as the CEO of a tech company that specialized in disruption. Disrupting industries, disrupting markets, and now, apparently, disrupting our marriage in the most public and humiliating way possible. What Michael didn't realize as he poured 3 glasses with practiced elegance was that Veronica's designer, red dress, which I recognized as a Valentino he must have purchased during his business trip to Milan last month, would be her last gift from him. The restaurant's soft lighting caught the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, the family heirloom that had mysteriously vanished from my jewelry box 2 months earlier. My grandmother's bracelet, the one she'd worn during 63 years of faithful marriage to my grandfather. How fitting that she'd chosen to wear it tonight. "You look beautiful as always, Claire," Michael said, his compliment landing like an insult. "Though I have to admit, Veronica reminds me of you when we first met. Before all the—" He gestured, vaguely at me, not finishing his sentence but making his meaning abundantly clear. Before the demands of supporting his career had taken their toll. Before the years of lonely nights while he networked had etched themselves into my face. Before I'd discovered his first affair 4 years ago and decided to stay, believing his tearful promises that it would never happen again. Veronica smiled, a flash of perfect teeth that had clearly benefited from expensive cosmetic dentistry. She was beautiful, I had to admit, with the kind of youthful confidence that comes from never having been betrayed. She wore her expensive clothes like armor, unaware that they would provide no protection against what was coming. "I thought we should clear the air," Michael continued, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd perfected in boardrooms across Silicon Valley. "No need to drag things out with lengthy proceedings. The papers will be delivered tomorrow. I've been generous with the settlement, you'll be comfortable." His emphasis on the last word made it sound like a consolation prize. The maitre d' approached our table, asking if everything was satisfactory. Michael dismissed him with a wave, not noticing the man's brief, sympathetic glance in my direction. In the 3 months I'd spent planning this evening, I'd visited Ciel 8 times, getting to know the staff, ensuring everything would go perfectly. They knew more about tonight than Michael could possibly imagine. Veronica shifted uncomfortably beside him, perhaps sensing something in my too calm demeanor. She was young, barely 26 according to the background check I'd run, but old, enough to know better. Old enough to understand that some lines shouldn't be crossed. Old enough to face the consequences of her choices. "You'll find someone else," Veronica offered, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Michael says you're very organized." She said it like it was a disease, something clinical and unsexy. That's what he thought of me now. Organized, efficient, useful, but not exciting. A first-generation model ready to be traded in for something newer, with better features. If only he knew how much planning, how much meticulous organization had gone into tonight. "I've prepared a timeline for the transition," Michael said, pulling out his phone to show me a calendar app. "You can stay in the condo until the end of the month, which gives you 3 weeks to find something suitable. The movers will come on the 30th. He'd already planned it all out. 3 weeks to dismantle the life we'd built together. 3 weeks. To erase a decade of memories. So efficient. So like Michael to treat our marriage like a business acquisition that had failed to deliver adequate returns." "Of course," I replied, lifting my champagne with a steady hand. "To new chapters." The irony of my toast was lost on them both. Michael smiled, clearly pleased with how maturely I was handling the situation. He'd always underestimated me, assumed that my quiet strength was weakness, my patience was passivity. The next few hours would change everything. I took a sip of the champagne, letting the bubbles dance on my tongue. The same champagne we'd shared on our wedding day, when he'd promised to love and cherish me forever. Promises were so easily made, and even more easily broken, but some promises I intended to keep. And I had made myself a promise 6 months ago, the day I found the first lipstick stain on his collar, that if Michael ever betrayed me again, I would ensure it was the last time he betrayed anyone. Each second that ticked by brought us closer to the moment when their perfect little world would implode. The evidence was already in place. The pieces had been moving for months. While they'd been enjoying their secret rendezvous and plotting their grand reveal, I'd been orchestrating something far more intricate. I smiled at Michael over the rim of my champagne flute. A genuine smile that seemed to catch him off guard. His brow furrowed slightly, the same tiny wrinkle that appeared when an investment wasn't performing as predicted. He'd expected tears, perhaps, or anger. A scene that would confirm his narrative of me as the emotional, unstable, soon-to-be ex-wife. "I appreciate your directness," I said, setting down my glass with deliberate precision. "It's always been one of your more admirable qualities." Michael relaxed visibly, exchanging a quick glance with Veronica that screamed, "See? This is going perfectly." "I thought you might be difficult about this," he admitted, reaching for the breadbasket. "I'm glad you're being reasonable." Reasonable. Another word from Michael's arsenal of corporate praise. Reasonable people didn't cause scenes. Reasonable people accepted inevitable outcomes. Reasonable people didn't interfere with Michael Coleman's carefully plotted life trajectory. "May I?" I asked, gesturing to the bracelet on Veronica's wrist. "It's been in my family for generations. I'd love to see how it looks on you." Veronica hesitated, glancing at Michael, who nodded his permission. She extended her slender arm across the table, and I took her hand with gentle fingers, examining the bracelet with what appeared to be admiration. "My grandmother wore this at her own anniversary celebrations," I said conversationally, my thumb brushing over the clasp. 63 of them, actually. She always said jewelry absorbs the energy of those who wear it, carries their stories, their intentions. I released Veronica's wrist, noting the slight discomfort in her eyes. Good. Let her wonder what energy she was wearing. Let her feel the weight of stolen history on her skin. "The sommelier has selected a perfect wine pairing for each course," I continued smoothly, as the first appetizers arrived. "The truffle risotto is extraordinary here, Michael. You should try it, unless your tastes have changed recently. Claire." "Always did have excellent taste," Michael said to Veronica, as if I weren't there. She planned all our vacations, selected our home, even chose my wardrobe when we first got married. Very detail-oriented. The way he said it made my years of supporting his career sound like a character flaw. Every tie I'd selected to complement his complexion during important meetings. Every social connection I'd cultivated to advance his position, reduced to the fussy habits of a controlling wife. Someone had to pay attention to the details, I replied lightly, while you were focusing on the big picture. The waiter appeared with our first wine, a crisp Sancerre that paired perfectly with the seafood appetizer. I noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he poured Michael's glass. The staff at Ciel had been generously compensated for their cooperation tonight, but they were still human, still aware of the drama unfolding at Table 7. Table 7. Tell me about yourself, Veronica, I said, turning my attention to her. Michael mentioned you work in marketing at Pinnacle Tech? Her eyes widened slightly. Michael hadn't told her that he'd discussed her with me. Another small crack in their united front. Yes, she started. Veronica is being considered for the Director of Brand Innovation position, Michael interrupted. She's already transformed their social media strategy completely. Impressive, I nodded. That's quite an achievement for someone only 3 years out of college. Another calculated revelation. I knew exactly when she'd graduated from San Diego State with her unremarkable marketing degree. I knew about the 2 positions she'd held before Pinnacle, both ending under unclear circumstances. I knew more about Veronica Hayes than Michael could imagine. How did you know? She began. Lucky guess, I smiled. You have that fresh-faced enthusiasm only recent graduates maintain in corporate America. Michael's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, frowning. Everything okay? I asked innocently. Fine, he muttered, turning the phone face down. Just work. At 8:17 p.m. on our anniversary dinner, right on schedule. The first message would be from the board chairman, asking for an urgent call. Michael wouldn't take it, not here, not now, when he was orchestrating his personal drama so perfectly. His pride wouldn't allow it. You know, I said, taking another sip of wine. I've been thinking about going back to work myself. Michael actually laughed at this. You haven't worked in 7 years, Claire. 8, I corrected him gently. 8 years, 2 months, and 17 days. Not since you said it would be better for your image to have a wife who focused on our home and your career advancement. Veronica shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps Michael hadn't shared that particular detail about our marriage. But we all evolve, don't we? I continued. Actually, I've already had a few interviews. Interviews? Michael's tone was skeptical. For what kind of position? Oh, nothing as impressive as brand innovation director, I said, nodding appreciatively. As the waiter refilled my wine. Just leveraging my old skills. Did I ever tell you about my work before we met, Veronica? Michael doesn't like to talk about it much. Something in finance, right? She ventured. Corporate security and risk assessment, I corrected her. I specialized in identifying vulnerabilities in systems, finding the weak points where things could break down. Michael's phone buzzed again, and again. 3 messages in rapid succession. His jaw tightened as he reached for it, then thought better of it. He'd always prided himself on never being the man who checked his phone during dinner. Image was everything to Michael Coleman. You'll have to forgive me, he said, standing abruptly. I need to make a quick call. Business emergency. He looked at Veronica. I'll just be a minute. As he walked toward the restaurant entrance, I noticed the subtle nod from the maitre d' to the server stationed by the kitchen, everything proceeding according to plan. He works too hard, Veronica offered in the awkward silence, attempting to establish solidarity between us. Yes, I agreed, though I've always found it interesting which emergencies he chooses to address and which ones he ignores. She didn't know how to respond to that. The comfortable script she'd prepared, the sympathetic but firm new girlfriend, The regrettable but necessary transition was falling apart without Michael to guide her through it. "How long have you been seeing each other?" I asked, though I knew the answer down to the day. Truthfully, Veronica twisted the bracelet on her wrist. 6 months, she admitted. "But he was going to tell you. Tonight wasn't supposed to happen this way." "No?" I raised an eyebrow. "How was it supposed to happen?" "He was going to tell you privately," she insisted. "But then he thought, since you'd already made the reservation at this beautiful place, and you were always so practical." She trailed off, realizing how this sounded. So practical that I wouldn't mind being publicly humiliated on my anniversary. I finished for her. So practical that I would simply accept being replaced by the upgraded model without any fuss? Veronica at least had the decency to look ashamed. "I'm sorry. This was his idea. I told him it was cruel. But not cruel enough to refuse to participate," I noted. She had no response to that. I checked my watch. Michael had been gone for exactly 4 minutes, which meant he was currently discovering that his business emergency was more serious than he'd anticipated. The board chairman would be explaining that unusual financial discrepancies had been discovered. Emergency meetings were being called. The company's stock trading might need to be temporarily suspended. "I should check on Michael," Veronica said, starting to rise. "I wouldn't," I advised calmly. "He hates to be interrupted during business calls, one of the first lessons I learned as Mrs. Coleman." She sank back into her seat, uncertain. Without Michael, she was adrift, her role in this drama undefined. "He told me you had grown apart," she offered, as if this might soften the betrayal. "Did he mention how that happened?" I asked. "Did he tell you about the years I spent making sure his shirts were perfectly pressed for meetings? How I memorized the names of every board member's spouse and children so he could impress them with personal details? How I redecorated our home 5 times to create the perfect backdrop for the dinner parties that advanced his career?" Veronica stared at her plate. "Did he tell you about the miscarriage I had 3 years ago? How he sent flowers to the hospital, but couldn't miss the Tokyo investor meeting?" She looked up, shock evident in her eyes. "No, he never—" "Of course not," I smiled sadly. "That wouldn't fit the narrative of us growing apart. It would suggest that choices were made, priorities were set." Michael's phone, which he'd left on the table in his haste, buzzed again. Veronica stared at it, then at me. "Aren't you upset?" she finally asked. "You seem so calm." "Oh, I was upset," I assured her. 6 months ago, when I found the first receipt for a hotel room that wasn't from any business trip on his calendar. 5 months ago, when I noticed the charges from a jewelry store for items I never received. 4 months ago, when my grandmother's bracelet disappeared from my jewelry box. I gestured toward her wrist. I was very upset then. The waiter appeared with our main courses, setting them down with professional precision. "Madame, is Monsieur Coleman returning soon? His coq au vin will get cold." "I'm afraid he's been detained," I replied. "Business emergency." "Very good. Madame, we'll keep it warm." As he retreated, Veronica leaned forward. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, Veronica, that my patience has had a very long runway. But as of tonight, it has officially run out." Michael returned at that moment, his face ashen. He slid into the seat beside Veronica but didn't reach for his wine. "Problem at work?" I inquired politely. "Nothing I can't handle," he replied, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Just a misunderstanding with the quarterly reports." I nodded sympathetically. "Those can be so complicated. All those numbers, all those accounts. So easy for things to get mixed up." Michael's fingers drummed nervously against the table as he picked at his food, his earlier confidence evaporating with each new notification that lit up his phone. He'd silenced it after the 3rd call, but the screen continued to illuminate, with messages, each one clearly more urgent than the last. "You should eat," I suggested, cutting a perfect bite of my sea bass. The chef here is remarkable. I've gotten to know him quite well over the past few months. Did you know he trained in Lyon under Chef Moreau? The same chef who catered that investor's dinner where you met Chairman Phillips. Michael's head snapped up. You remember that? I remember everything, Michael. I dabbed my lips with the napkin, like how nervous you were before that dinner, how I researched Philip's background, discovered his passion for French cuisine, and suggested you mention your honeymoon in Provence to create a personal connection. Veronica looked between us, suddenly an outsider to a conversation steeped in shared history. That was a long time ago, Michael muttered, reaching for his wine. 7 years, 4 months, I corrected him. The night that secured your first round of major funding. You called me your secret weapon afterward. The waiter approached with a bottle of water, refilling our glasses. As he leaned over, I noticed him slip something discreetly beneath Michael's bread plate. An envelope, cream-colored and unobtrusive. Michael, distracted by his phone lighting up again, didn't notice. You've always had an impressive memory, Michael said, attempting to regain his footing. One of your many qualities. Indeed, I agreed. I remember the names of every board member at Pinnacle Technologies. I remember their spouses, their children, their favorite wines. I remember which ones were skeptical about hiring a 30-year-old CEO with more ambition than experience. Michael's jaw tightened. He didn't like being reminded of how much of his success had been architected by others, by his father's connections, by his early investors' guidance, by his wife's social maneuvering. I particularly remember Douglas Harmon telling me at last year's Christmas party that he'd never seen a wife add so much value to a CEO package. An odd compliment, but I understood. Douglas talks too much, Michael dismissed, but I could see the unease growing behind his eyes. Always has. He's certainly talking now, I remarked, nodding toward Michael's phone as it lit up again with Harmon's name. Fourth call in 20 minutes. Must be important. Michael adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd never managed to break. It's just a small issue with some financial reporting. Nothing serious. Of course not, I smiled. Though the board does tend to overreact to these things, don't they? Remember what happened to Jason Winters at Meridian Tech? One accounting discrepancy, and suddenly there was a full audit. He was out within a week. Veronica shifted uncomfortably. Should we perhaps reschedule this dinner? If Michael has urgent business? Absolutely not, Michael cut her off. This dinner is important. Important for his narrative, I knew. Important for him to maintain control, to demonstrate to Veronica that he was decisive, that he could end one chapter of his life and begin another with the same efficiency he applied to corporate acquisitions and divestitures. Have you told Veronica about the Cayman account? I asked casually, taking another sip of wine. Michael's hand froze halfway to his water glass. What? The offshore account, I elaborated. The one where you've been transferring company funds for the past 18 months. The one with her name on it, alongside yours. Veronica's face went pale. What is she talking about, Michael? I have no idea, he lied, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. Claire, if this is some attempt to create problems, creating problems is your specialty, not mine, I replied calmly. I just find them. It's what I was trained to do, remember? Before I became your wife, I was one of the top corporate security specialists in the country. You used to brag about it to your tech friends, how you'd stolen a hacker from the dark side. I turned to Veronica. He didn't mention that part of my background, did he? How I used to identify vulnerabilities in corporate security systems, trace financial discrepancies, build cases against white-collar criminals. She shook her head mutely, her eyes now fixed on Michael with growing concern. It's amazing how skills like that never really fade, I continued. Like riding a bicycle. Those late nights you thought I was taking online cooking classes? I was actually following your digital breadcrumbs. Every transfer, Every falsified report, every manipulated spreadsheet. Michael's face had lost all color. Now. This is absurd. You're making things up because you're hurt. I understand that, but account number 8572961, I recited from memory. Cayman Islands First International Bank, opened 16 months ago with an initial deposit of $250,000 from your personal savings. Subsequent deposits ranging from $50,000 to $1.2 million, all routed through shell companies in Luxembourg and Singapore. Current balance approximately $7.4 million. The silence that fell over our table was absolute. Even the ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade away. How did you? Michael began. No, I finished for him. The same way I know that Veronica isn't really a marketing prodigy. The same way I know that her previous two employers asked her to leave after discovering irregularities in their accounts. The same way I know that you two met not at a conference, as you told your friends, but through a private message on FinSecure, the same forum where aspiring corporate fraudsters share tips on evading detection. Veronica's hand flew to her throat, her breathing becoming shallow. Michael, what is she talking about? Don't play innocent, I advised her. It doesn't suit someone who helped design a scheme to embezzle nearly $8 million. The offshore account is in both your names. For a reason. Michael's phone began to ring again. This time he grabbed it, checking the caller ID. The CEO calling the CEO, never a good sign. He rejected the call with a swipe. You've been busy these past 6 months, haven't you, Claire? Michael said, his voice low and dangerous. Spying? On me? Hacking into my accounts? You realize that's illegal? Not when the accounts are joint marital property, I corrected him. Not when my name is on the incorporation documents of your shell companies. Documents you forged my signature on, by the way. That's something the forensic accountants found particularly interesting. Forensic accountants? Veronica whispered, now truly alarmed. I noticed how she'd subtly shifted away from Michael, creating physical distance between them. The first rat preparing to abandon the sinking ship. Did Michael tell you his plan for after the divorce? I asked her. How you'd both wait 6 months, then reunite publicly in Paris or Rome. How you'd access the Cayman funds and start a new life while Pinnacle Technologies tried to recover from the accounting errors he'd blame on his CFO. Michael's eyes darted toward the restaurant entrance, calculating the distance, perhaps considering making a scene, or a run for it. Don't, I advised quietly. There are 2 SEC agents having coffee at the bar. They've been there since we arrived. The maitre d' has instructions not to let you leave without settling the bill, which, incidentally, includes an excellent 2008 Bordeaux that the sommelier is about to present. As if on cue, the sommelier appeared with a dusty bottle, presenting it to the table with a flourish. Madame, the special selection you requested to commemorate your anniversary. Chateau Lafite Rothschild, 2008. A most exceptional year. Thanks you, Antoine. I nodded, watching Michael's face. He recognized the bottle immediately, identical to the one we'd shared on our wedding night, a gift from his father who had told him, "Save the good wine for the woman who makes you a better man." An inspired choice, madame, Antoine continued, beginning the careful process of opening the prized vintage. Shall I decant it for the table? Please, I replied. My husband and his guest should experience it properly. As Antoine departed, with the wine, Michael leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want? Interesting question, I mused. What does anyone want when they've discovered their spouse is a fraud in every sense of the word? When they've learned that the man they supported for a decade has been planning to discard them and disappear with millions in stolen funds? The envelope beneath Michael's bread plate caught my eye again. I reached across the table and slid it out, pushing it toward him. What's this? He asked suspiciously. Open it, I suggested. Consider it an anniversary gift. With trembling fingers, Michael tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printout of an email from the board of directors at Kai. Pinnacle Technologies, dated that morning. It detailed the preliminary findings of an internal audit, the freezing of several suspicious accounts, and the board's unanimous decision to place Michael on administrative leave pending a full investigation. "This is dated today," he said hoarsely. "How did you get a copy before you did?" I finished for him. "I've been working with Douglas Harmon for the past 3 months. The audit was my suggestion, actually, as was the timing of this announcement." Veronica reached for her purse, clearly preparing to make an exit. "I should give you two some privacy to discuss this." "That would be a mistake," I informed her calmly. "The SEC agents at the bar aren't just here for Michael. Your name is on those accounts too, remember? The difference is, you have a history of financial impropriety. This is your third company, your third married executive, your third embezzlement. Scheme. The prosecutors find that pattern particularly compelling." Her hand froze on her purse, her face a mask of fear. "I'm curious," I said, leaning forward slightly. "When you helped Michael plan tonight's little humiliation, did you consider how it would play to a jury? How bringing a mistress to an anniversary dinner, wearing stolen family jewelry no less, might influence their perception of his character?" The sommelier returned with the decanted wine, pouring a small amount for Michael to taste. He stared at the ruby liquid, unable to lift the glass. "My husband appears overwhelmed by the bouquet," I told Antoine. "Perhaps we should give it a moment to breathe." As Antoine withdrew again, Michael found his voice. "You've been planning this for months." 6 months, I confirmed. "Since I found the first evidence of your affair and your fraud. The same night? You told me you'd be working late but were actually having dinner with Veronica at Luciano's. I paid for that dinner, by the way. It was on our joint credit card." "You could have just asked for a divorce," he said bitterly. "The way you did? By ambushing me at our anniversary dinner?" I shook my head. "Besides, divorce wouldn't have solved the bigger problem. Your systematic theft from the company, the investors, the employees whose pensions you've been quietly siphoning from." Michael's phone lit up again, this time with a text from his attorney. He grabbed it, reading the message with growing horror. "They've frozen all my accounts," he whispered. "Personal and business." "Standard procedure in fraud cases," I nodded. "They move quite quickly once they have sufficient evidence. The warrants for your electronic devices were approved this morning. I imagine the digital forensics team is already combing through your cloud storage." I excused myself to the restroom, maintaining perfect composure as I felt their eyes on my back. The burgundy dress I wore, Michael's favorite, or so he'd once claimed, suddenly felt like armor rather than the conciliatory gesture I'd pretended it was when getting dressed this evening. In the elegant bathroom with its soft lighting and fresh orchids, I checked my reflection. Not a hair out of place, not a smudge in my carefully applied makeup. The woman staring back at me looked polished, controlled, and dangerous. Tonight wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of something else entirely. I allowed myself a small smile. Sometimes the perfect revenge requires the perfect audience. My phone buzzed with an incoming text from Agent Kalman. "Second envelope delivered to Maitre D, moving to position." Perfect timing. I took one final glance in the mirror and returned to the dining room, where Michael was furiously typing on his phone, presumably trying to reach someone who could fix the situation. Veronica sat frozen, her champagne untouched, her eyes darting around the restaurant as if sizing up escape routes. "Did I miss anything?" I asked pleasantly, reclaiming my seat. "This is insane," Michael hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting attention from nearby diners. "You've completely lost your mind. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I believe that's my line," I replied calmly, smoothing my napkin across my lap. "Though I've had 6 months to process it, while you're just now realizing the consequences of your actions." The sommelier approached with our now decanted wine, pouring a generous glass for each of us. Michael didn't touch his. Veronica looked like she might be sick. A toast, I suggested, raising my glass. To honesty, however belated. This isn't a game, Claire, Michael warned, leaning forward. You've just destroyed everything. The company, our future. Our future? I interrupted, arching an eyebrow. I believe that ship sailed when you decided to bring your mistress to our anniversary dinner and call her an upgrade. Veronica winced at my words. Good. Let her feel a fraction of the humiliation I'd been meant to endure tonight. You need to call off whatever you've set in motion, Michael insisted, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. Tell Harmon it was a misunderstanding. We can work this out. The way you worked out our marriage? I asked softly. With deception and betrayal? People get divorced every day, he countered. It doesn't warrant destroying someone's entire life. Divorce, yes. Fraud, no. I took a sip of the exceptional wine. The divorce is between you and me. The fraud investigation is between you and the SEC, the Board of Directors, and possibly the Department of Justice. Michael's hand suddenly shot across the table, grabbing my wrist hard enough to make me gasp. You need to fix this, he demanded, his voice a dangerous whisper. I looked pointedly at his hand until he released me. Careful, Michael. The SEC agents are still watching, and assault charges wouldn't improve your situation. He withdrew his hand as if burned, glancing nervously toward the bar. Besides, I continued, there's nothing to fix. The evidence speaks for itself. Your financial manipulations, your falsified reports, your embezzlement scheme, all meticulously documented and verified by forensic accountants. Did you think no one would notice $7.4 million disappearing from the company's accounts? Those transactions were legitimate business expenses, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Really? The $350,000 wire transfer to the shell company that purchased Veronica's condo? The $175,000 for her Aston Martin? The $42,000 for that little trip to Bali last month? The conference you claimed to be attending in Seattle? Veronica's eyes widened at each revelation. You said those were gifts from your personal accounts, she whispered to Michael. They were, he snapped back. No, I corrected him gently. They came from accounts held by Zenith Holdings and Meridian Ventures, shell companies you created to funnel money from Pinnacle Technologies. The forensic trail is quite clear. The maitre d' approached our table, carrying a sealed envelope on a silver tray. Excuse me, Mr. Coleman. This just arrived for you. Michael snatched the envelope, tearing it open with shaking hands. As he read the contents, what little color remained in his face drained away. He looked up at me with genuine fear in his eyes. Search warrants, he said hoarsely. They're searching our home, my office, the lake house. How did they move so quickly? I've been building this case for 6 months, I reminded him. All the evidence was already collected, organized, and presented to the proper authorities. Today was simply the execution phase. In our home? His voice cracked slightly. What will they find? I tilted my head, studying him. Interesting question. What are you worried they'll discover, Michael? The hidden safe behind the Picasso in your study? The one with the second set of books? The passport in your mother's maiden name? The $50,000 in cash? His sharp intake of breath confirmed my suspicions. How did you know about that? He demanded. I've known about it for years, I replied. Since you installed it during the renovation of your study. Did you think the contractor wouldn't mention it to me? That I wouldn't find the invoice? Veronica was now openly staring at Michael, reassessing everything she thought she knew about him. I could see the calculations behind her eyes, how much trouble she was in, whether she could save herself by turning on him. Michael, she began carefully, you told me this was about tax efficiency. You never said anything about embezzlement or fraud. It's not. He started to protest, but she cut him off. Did you set me up to take the fall for this? Her voice rose slightly. Is that why my name is on those accounts? So you could blame me if things went wrong? The first cracks in their united front were widening into chasms. I sat back, sipping my wine, and watched their alliance crumble. Of course not, Michael insisted, but his eyes shifted away from hers. The accounts are in both our names because we were planning a future together. After framing the CFO for the missing funds, I added helpfully. That was the plan, wasn't it? Thomas would take the fall. You'd express appropriate shock and dismay. The board would keep you on to manage the crisis, and 6 months later, you'd quietly resign to spend more time with family. By then, the money would be safely laundered. Through your network of shell companies. Michael stared at me in disbelief. How could you possibly know all this? I reached into my purse and withdrew a small digital recorder, placing it on the table. Because you told me, Michael. Or rather, you told Veronica during several intimate conversations in what you believed was the privacy of your Seattle hotel room. Veronica gasped. You bugged our room? Not exactly, I replied. The Seattle waterfront hotel has had serious security vulnerabilities for years. Their surveillance system is embarrassingly easy to access remotely if you know what you're doing. Which, as it happens, I do. I pressed play on the recorder, and Michael's voice filled our small bubble of space, carefully calibrated to be audible only at our table. Once the divorce is final, I'll push Thomas to take more control over the quarterly reporting. He's eager to prove himself. We'll modify the algorithm to flag his access credentials on the suspicious transactions. When the discrepancies inevitably surface, all evidence will point to him. Veronica's voice followed. Won't they investigate you too, as CEO? The board trusts me implicitly. Besides, by then we'll have the perfect motive established for Thomas. Janet let slip that he's got a gambling problem. Nothing serious, but enough that we can amplify it with a few strategic rumors. Everyone will believe he was desperate enough to embezzle funds. I stopped the recording. There's much more, of course. Hours of similar conversations, all thoroughly documented and time-stamped. You two really should be more careful about what you discuss in hotel rooms. Michael looked utterly defeated, slumping back in his chair. Veronica, however, had moved from shock to calculation with impressive speed. I didn't know, she insisted, leaning toward me. Michael told me the offshore accounts were legal tax avoidance strategies. I had no idea he was stealing from the company. Save it for the prosecutors, I advised her. Though I should mention that they have recordings of you actively suggesting improvements to the embezzlement scheme. Something about using cryptocurrency for certain transfers to avoid traditional banking scrutiny? She paled again, her last avenue of escape closing before her eyes. The sound of purposeful footsteps approaching our table drew all our attention. Agent Kalman, whom I recognized from our previous meetings, was walking toward us, accompanied by Agent Rivera. Both wore the unmistakable serious expressions of federal agents about to make an arrest. Michael Coleman? Kalman asked, though it was clearly just a formality. Michael nodded mutely. I'm Special Agent David Kalman with the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is Special Agent Rivera. We need you to come with us to answer some questions regarding potential securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement at Pinnacle Technologies. Am I under arrest? Michael asked, his voice barely audible. Not at this time, Kalman replied. But we do have a warrant to search your personal electronic devices. I'll need your phone, sir. Michael hesitated, clutching his phone as if it were a lifeline. The phone, Mr. Coleman, Kalman repeated more firmly. Now, with visible reluctance, Michael surrendered his device. Ms. Hayes? Agent Rivera addressed Veronica. We'll need to speak with you as well. Of course, she managed, gathering her purse with shaking hands. I'm happy to cooperate fully. I'm sure you are, I commented dryly. particularly since cooperation is your only hope of avoiding significant jail time. The maitre d' appeared again, this time with the restaurant manager, creating a discreet barrier between our unfolding drama and the other diners. Perhaps it would be best to continue this conversation somewhere more private, the manager suggested tactfully. We have a room available. Agent Kalman nodded his agreement. Mr. Coleman, Ms. Hayes, if you'll come with us. As they stood to follow the agents, Michael turned to me one last time. You've been planning this for months, he said, a mix of anger and reluctant admiration in his voice. All of it. The dinner, the timing, everything. Yes, I acknowledged simply. While you were planning to discard me, I was planning to expose you. It turns out I'm better at execution than you are. What happens now? He asked, suddenly looking lost, all his arrogance stripped away. Now, I said, rising from my seat with dignity, I finish my anniversary dinner, alone, with an excellent bottle of wine. Michael and Veronica were led away, leaving me at the table we'd been meant to share. The restaurant manager approached, hesitantly. Madame Coleman, I'm so sorry about this disruption. Please allow us to— It's quite all right, Henri, I assured him. Everything has proceeded exactly as planned. Please thank your staff for their discretion and assistance. As he withdrew, I poured myself another glass of the Chateau Lafite, savoring its complex notes of blackcurrant and cedar. The culmination of 6 months of meticulous planning had unfolded perfectly, each element timed with precision. Michael's public humiliation had backfired spectacularly, becoming instead the stage for his own undoing. I raised my glass in a silent toast to myself, to resilience, to justice served with perfect timing. The night was still young, and I had one more act to complete before this story reached its conclusion. As the restaurant settled back into its normal rhythm, I found myself alone at the table for 3, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been an anniversary celebration. Henri, the restaurant manager, approached with quiet deference. Madame Coleman, would you prefer to move to a smaller table? Perhaps something more private? No, thank you, Henri, I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. But I would appreciate some company if you can spare a moment. Surprised, he hesitated before taking the offered seat. Of course, madame. Do you know why I chose Le Ciel for this particular evening? I asked, swirling the wine in my glass. I assumed because of its reputation and discretion, he answered carefully. Partially, I acknowledged. But primarily because 7 years ago, Michael proposed to me here. Before the Michelin star, before the celebrity clientele. When Le Ciel was still finding its identity and struggling to stay afloat. Henri's eyes widened with recognition. You were the couple in the garden alcove? The night of the terrible storm. I nodded, pleased he remembered. The power went out across the entire block. The kitchen was in chaos. But your staff brought candles to every table, and Chef Marcel insisted on completing our tasting menu over portable burners. Michael said it was the most romantic night of his life. I remember now, Henri said, relaxing slightly. Your husband, Mr. Coleman. He sent champagne to the entire kitchen staff afterward, and made a significant investment in our renovation, the following month. At my suggestion, I confirmed. I recognized the potential here, just as I recognized the potential in Michael all those years ago. A shadow passed over Henri's face. Madame, if I had known the nature of tonight's events, I might have advised. You did exactly what was needed, I assured him. Your staff performed perfectly. This evening unfolded precisely as it should have. Henri studied me with new understanding. You weren't surprised by any of this, were you? The federal agents? The accusations? Surprise requires uncertainty, Henri. I left nothing to chance. The maitre d' approached with a small leather folder. The final bill, madame, as requested. I accepted it with a nod. Thank you, Philippe. Please add a 20% gratuity for the staff. Their performance tonight was flawless. As Philippe withdrew, Henri leaned forward slightly. May I ask, Madame Coleman, how did you know? About your husband's activities, I mean. I considered his question while signing the credit card slip, the last charge I would ever make to the joint account Michael had so generously offered to maintain until our divorce was finalized. Did you know I used to work in corporate security? I asked instead of answering directly. Before I met Michael, I specialized in identifying vulnerabilities in financial systems, places where someone with the right knowledge could extract money undetected. Like a consultant for banks? Something like that, I smiled. Though my specific expertise was in understanding the human element. Technology can be secured with firewalls and encryption. People are more permeable. I remembered the exact moment when my suspicions about Michael had crystallized into certainty. It hadn't been the unexplained hotel charges or the missing jewelry. It had been a simple phone call 6 months ago, one he'd taken in our kitchen, while I prepared dinner. We need to accelerate the timeline, he'd said to someone, his voice low but audible as I chopped vegetables at the island. The Q3 audit is being moved up. Make sure all the transfers are reconciled by the 15th. At the time, I'd thought he was discussing a legitimate business concern, but something in his tone, a tension I recognized from my years investigating corporate fraud, had triggered my professional instincts. That night, after Michael had fallen asleep, I'd accessed his laptop using the password he thought I didn't know. 3 hours later, I had found the first evidence of his embezzlement scheme. A series of invoices from non-existent vendors, each authorized personally by Michael, each paid to accounts that eventually funneled money to Cayman Islands First International Bank. The human element is always the weakest link in any security system, I told Henri. People get comfortable. They get careless. They start believing they're too clever to be caught. Henri nodded thoughtfully. And your husband? He underestimated you. Michael saw what he expected to see, I explained. The supportive wife, who had given up her career for his. The social partner who planned perfect dinner parties but didn't understand complex financial transactions. The aging first wife, easily replaced by a newer model. I reached for my purse, a Hermes Kelly bag Michael had given me for our 5th anniversary, and withdrew a small flash drive. What he failed to consider was that I had spent a decade learning everything about his business. I attended every dinner with every board member. I read every press release, every quarterly report. I listened to every earnings call, not because I was a dutiful corporate wife, but because I never stopped being a security specialist. The memories of those first few weeks of investigation washed over me. The nights spent meticulously documenting every suspicious transaction. The carefully orchestrated spa weekends that were actually meetings with former colleagues in corporate security. The gradual accumulation of evidence that would eventually bring down not just Michael, but a network of co-conspirators throughout Pinnacle Technologies. When did you discover the other woman? Henri asked delicately. Veronica? I laughed, softly. She wasn't as careful as she thought. Designer stores send thank you emails when someone makes a significant purchase. Michael used our joint email for her first gift. A rookie mistake. After that, finding their connection was simple. What I didn't tell Henri was how that discovery had transformed my investigation from professional to personal. Until then, I had been methodically building a case against corporate fraud. Afterward, I had been orchestrating the perfect downfall for a man who had betrayed every promise he'd ever made to me. The interesting thing about Veronica, I continued, was discovering she wasn't just Michael's mistress. She was an active participant in his financial scheme. Her background made that clear. 2 previous positions at tech companies, both ending abruptly when financial irregularities were discovered. She wasn't just the other woman. She was his accomplice. Henri's eyebrows rose. And that made your response more justified? It made it more comprehensive, I corrected him. If this had been merely about infidelity, I might have simply divorced him and taken my share of our assets. But when I realized they were planning to steal millions while framing an innocent colleague, that required a more sophisticated intervention. I'd spent 3 months building my case before approaching Douglas Harmon, the most ethically rigorous member of Pinnacle's board. I still remembered his face as I'd laid out the evidence in his private office, away from any corporate surveillance. "My God, Claire," he'd whispered, paging through the meticulous documentation. "How long have you known about this?" "Long enough to build an airtight case," I'd replied. "But I need your help to ensure it's handled properly. There are people at Pinnacle who trust Michael implicitly. People who might warn him if they learned about an investigation." Douglas had studied me with newfound respect. "You're not at all what I expected Michael Coleman's wife to be." "I know," I'd smiled. "That's been extremely useful." Now, sitting in Ciel with the manager who had unwittingly played a role in my carefully orchestrated evening, I felt a sense of completion. "The authorities have been building this case for months," I told Henri. "All the evidence was in place. The accounts frozen, the warrants prepared. Tonight was simply theatrical timing." "The anniversary dinner," Henri nodded in understanding. "Your husband chose the date, I presume?" "He did," I confirmed. "When he called to confirm the reservation last week, the one I had actually made months ago, I knew he was planning something dramatic. The request for our usual anniversary table, the special champagne, but with an additional guest? It wasn't difficult to deduce his intentions. What Henri didn't need to know was how that confirmation had been the final piece in my plan. Michael's decision to humiliate me publicly on our anniversary had given me the perfect stage for his downfall. Poetic justice at its finest. "When the agents approached your table," Henri asked, "you didn't seem surprised." "I wasn't," I acknowledged. "In fact, I had personally selected tonight for the execution of the warrants. Agent Kalman was receptive to my suggestion that confronting Michael in a public setting would minimize the risk of him destroying evidence or attempting to flee." The look of amazement on Henry's face was gratifying. "You coordinated with federal agents?" "I've been working with them for months," I explained. "My background in financial crimes investigation made me an ideal consultant on the case. Of course, my personal connection to the primary suspect required some diplomatic handling, but once they verified my evidence independently, they were quite accommodating about the timing. I didn't mention the initial skepticism I'd faced from some agents who had assumed I was simply a vindictive wife making unfounded accusations. That skepticism had evaporated when they began corroborating my meticulously documented evidence. "The irony," I continued, finishing the last of my wine, "is that Michael's attempt to publicly humiliate me by bringing Veronica to our anniversary dinner actually strengthened the case against him. It demonstrated his character, his disregard for propriety, his arrogance, all qualities that will weigh against him when this goes to trial." Henri shook his head in amazement. "All this time, while he thought he was deceiving you. I was building the case that would end his career and quite possibly send him to prison," I finished for him. "Yes." The thought brought me no joy, only a sense of justice served. I had loved Michael once, deeply and completely. I had supported his ambitions, celebrated his successes, forgiven his first infidelity. But I would not be made a fool of. Not by Michael, not by Veronica, not by anyone. "What will you do now, Madame Coleman?" Henry asked softly. I considered the question. For 6 months, my life had been consumed by this investigation, this meticulous plotting. Now that it had reached its culmination, a strange sense of freedom washed over me. "First, I'll finish this extraordinary wine," I said, lifting my glass. "Then tomorrow I'll begin the process of reclaiming my own identity. My maiden name, my career, my independence. And Pinnacle Technologies, with Mr. Coleman removed as CEO, The board has already approached me about serving as a special advisor during the transition, I revealed. My background in corporate security makes me uniquely qualified to help them strengthen their financial controls and restore investor confidence. Henri's eyes widened. So you'll be taking his position? Not exactly, I smiled. I'll be healing the company he nearly destroyed. There's a difference. After thanking Henri for his company, I asked for my coat and stepped outside into the cool, evening air. The valet brought around my car, not the luxury SUV Michael had insisted we needed for image purposes, but my own modest sedan that I'd kept despite his protests. Another small act of independence that had irritated him over the years. As I drove through the city streets toward the hotel where I'd booked a room for the night, knowing I wouldn't want to return to our home immediately after the confrontation, I reflected on the meticulous preparation that had led to tonight's culmination. 6 months earlier, after discovering those first suspicious transactions, I had faced a critical decision: confront Michael immediately or investigate further. The security specialist in me had recognized that premature confrontation would only drive evidence underground. So I'd chosen patience, a strategy that had served me well throughout my career. My first step had been creating a secure working environment. I'd converted the guest house at our lake property, a place Michael rarely visited, into my investigation headquarters. A new laptop purchased with cash, a separate internet connection registered under my maiden name, and a prepaid phone for sensitive communications. All basic tradecraft from my security days. I remembered the first time I'd followed Michael after becoming suspicious. He'd told me he was working late, but his location tracking, which he didn't know I could access, showed him at Luciano's, an upscale restaurant across town. I'd parked across the street, watching through the window as he dined intimately with Veronica, his hand caressing hers across the table. The betrayal had stung, but more concerning was their behavior. Furtive glances, documents passed between them, the unmistakable body language of conspirators rather than just lovers. That night had changed everything. What might have been merely a painful divorce had transformed into something more complex when I'd photographed them reviewing what appeared to be financial documents. Not company materials in branded folders, but plain papers that they hurriedly concealed when the waiter approached. The following week had been a masterclass in covert investigation. I'd placed a keylogger on our home computer, the one Michael occasionally used for personal emails. I'd recovered deleted browser history showing research on offshore banking laws. I'd photographed notes he'd carelessly left in his home office, trash can with account numbers and transfer amounts. Most critically, I'd used my old security credentials to access specialized databases, tracing the shell companies Michael had established to launder the embezzled funds. Each company, Zenith Holdings, Meridian Ventures, Apex Solutions, existed only on paper, each registered in privacy-friendly jurisdictions like Delaware and Nevada, before funneling money to the Cayman Islands. 3 weeks into my investigation, I'd made a pivotal discovery. Veronica Hayes was not who she claimed to be. Her LinkedIn profile listed prestigious marketing positions at Archer Technologies and Westlake Innovations. But careful research revealed she'd worked under the name Elena Vasquez at Archer, and before that as Valerie Harmon at Westlake. Both companies had experienced financial irregularities during her tenure. Both had quietly let her go without pressing charges, typical for companies more concerned with public image than justice. I remembered the night I'd discovered her true identity, staying up until dawn, building a profile of this woman who had not only taken my husband, but was helping him defraud his company. Her pattern was consistent. Target a rising executive with access to financial controls, establish both personal and professional relationships, assist in creating embezzlement schemes, then disappear when the money was secured or risk of discovery grew too high. Michael wasn't even her first married executive. He was her third. By month 2, I'd established a secure line of communication with Douglas Harmon from Pinnacle's board. Our first meeting had been carefully arranged at a coffee shop 2 towns over. "Why come to me with this?" he'd asked after reviewing my preliminary evidence. "Why not go directly to the authorities?" "Because corporate politics complicates justice," I'd explained. "Michael has allies on the board, people who might warn him, help him cover his tracks. I need someone on the inside who understands the gravity of the situation and has the ethical backbone to handle it properly." Douglas had been the perfect choice, the longest-serving board member, respected for his integrity, and crucially, someone who had expressed reservations when Michael was appointed CEO. He'd been overruled by Michael's mentor and primary supporter, Chairman Phillips, who had since retired. Together, we'd established a careful protocol for our investigation. Douglas would request routine audits of specific departments, gradually narrowing focus toward the suspicious transactions without alerting Michael. I would continue gathering evidence independently, building a parallel case that could be turned over to authorities when the time was right. "What about Thomas Liu?" Douglas had asked during one of our meetings. "Michael's CFO. He must either be involved or suspiciously oblivious." "That's what I initially thought," I'd admitted. "But after monitoring their communications, I'm convinced Thomas is being set up as the fall guy. Michael has been systematically creating evidence to implicate him when the fraud is eventually discovered. Saving Thomas from becoming a scapegoat had become another motivation driving my careful planning. A decent man with a young family, he'd been manipulated by Michael's careful mentorship, groomed not for advancement, as Thomas believed, but for culpability. Month 3 had brought a significant breakthrough when I'd managed to access Michael and Veronica's communications. Not through illegal hacking, as Michael had accused tonight, but through a much simpler vulnerability: Veronica's vanity. She'd been using Michael's corporate credit card to pay for her personal cloud storage, the same storage where she'd been, keeping copies of their text exchanges and photos as insurance for herself. A basic security precaution on her part, but she'd made a critical mistake, using the same password across multiple accounts. Once I'd discovered her pattern, her birth date combined with her mother's maiden name, accessing her backup files, had been trivial. The evidence I'd found had been damning. Explicit discussions of which accounts to target, how to disguise the transfers, which board members might become suspicious. Most incriminating were their conversations about framing Thomas, including detailed plans to plant evidence on his devices and spread rumors about gambling debts he didn't actually have. By month 4, I'd compiled enough evidence to approach Agent Kalman at the SEC. Our first meeting had been predictably skeptical on his part. "We get calls from angry spouses all the time, Mrs. Coleman," he'd said, barely glancing at the file I'd prepared. "Most of them amount to nothing." "I understand," I'd replied calmly. "That's why I've brought only the preliminary evidence. Enough to justify a formal investigation, not enough to waste your time if I'm mistaken, which I'm not." My professional approach and meticulously organized evidence had eventually won him over. By our third meeting, he'd brought in Agent Rivera from the Financial Crimes Division. "You've done our job for us," Rivera had commented, reviewing my documentation. "Most of our cases don't come with such comprehensive roadmaps." I was very good at my job before I became Mrs. Michael Coleman, I'd told her simply. The 5th month had been devoted to coordination and timing. With the SEC now fully engaged, Douglas had been working from within Pinnacle to preserve evidence while appearing to conduct routine oversight. I'd been carefully documenting Michael's movements, identifying the perfect moment to execute the warrants and confrontation. We'd considered multiple scenarios: confronting him at the office, waiting until he returned home one evening, intercepting him during a business trip. But when I'd discovered his plans for our anniversary dinner, through a careless comment to his assistant that I'd overheard during a rare visit to his office, I'd known immediately that would be the perfect setting. "He's planning to bring his mistress to your anniversary dinner?" Agent Kalman had been genuinely shocked when I'd shared this information. "That's..." Poetically appropriate, I'd finished for him. Don't you think? The perfect venue for his public downfall. The final month had been consumed with precise planning. Every detail of tonight's dinner had been choreographed. The table location visible to security cameras, the timing of the agent's arrival, the delivery of key evidence at specific moments. I'd visited Ciel multiple times, getting to know the staff, ensuring their cooperation. I'd even planned my wardrobe carefully. The burgundy dress Michael had once claimed was his favorite, paired with understated jewelry that projected confident elegance rather than desperate attempt to reclaim his attention. Every element had been chosen to control the narrative, to ensure that anyone who witnessed tonight's events would see not a scorned wife lashing out, but a composed professional exposing corruption. Now, as I pulled into the hotel parking lot, I reflected on how my professional skills had saved me from personal devastation. When Michael had betrayed me, he'd forgotten, or never truly understood, who I really was. Not just his supportive wife, but a woman who had spent years investigating financial criminals before we'd met. A woman who knew how to follow money, trails, document evidence, and build airtight cases. A woman who would not be discarded like an obsolete device. In the hotel lobby, the concierge greeted me by name, another detail I'd arranged in advance. "Good evening, Ms. Harrington," he said, using my maiden name. "Your suite is ready, and the package you were expecting has been delivered to your room." "Thank you, Edward," I replied, accepting the keycard. The package contained the final element of my preparation, documents for my new consulting firm, specializing in corporate security and fraud prevention. The incorporation papers had been filed last week, the website would go live tomorrow, and 3 former colleagues had already agreed to join my team. While Michael had been planning to discard me with a comfortable settlement, I'd been preparing to rebuild my career, my identity, and my future. The preparation hadn't just been about exposing his crimes, it had been about reclaiming myself. In my suite, I found the package on the desk, alongside a bottle of champagne and a handwritten note from Agent Rivera. "Congratulations on a flawless operation. Justice served." I opened the champagne and poured a glass, toasting my reflection in the window overlooking the city lights. The woman staring back at me was no longer Michael Coleman's wife. She was Claire Harrington, security specialist, expert witness, corporate consultant, and she was just getting started. 3 weeks after the anniversary dinner, I stood in the doorway of what had once been our shared home, watching as the movers carried out the last of Michael's belongings. His attorney had arranged for the removal of his personal items while he remained under house arrest at his parents' residence, the judge having denied bail initially due to flight risk concerns. The marble foyer that had once showcased our perfect life through carefully curated artwork and designer furniture now echoed with emptiness. I found the barrenness oddly refreshing. A blank canvas awaiting a new vision. "That's the last of it, Ms. Harrington," the moving company supervisor said, clipboard in hand. "Is there anything else you need from us?" "No, thank you," I replied, signing the form he offered. "You've been very thorough." As they departed, I walked through the house that had been the backdrop for a decade of my life. Memories lingered in every room, some worth preserving, others better left behind. In the master bedroom, I opened the walk-in closet that had once been filled with Michael's bespoke suits and designer shoes. Now it held only empty hangers and the faint scent of his cologne. My phone rang, Douglas Harmon calling with an update. "Claire, the board meeting just concluded," he said without preamble. "It was unanimous. Thomas has been fully exonerated and offered the interim CFO position while we search for a permanent CEO." "He deserves it," I replied, genuinely pleased. For Thomas. "Has he accepted?" "With conditions," Douglas chuckled. "He wants a complete audit of all financial systems and new security protocols implemented before he takes the helm. Smart man." "He learned the hard way," I noted. Has there been any media fallout from this morning's announcement? Stock took an initial hit when we disclosed the full extent of the fraud, but it's already rebounding. Your strategy of complete transparency was the right call. The market respects honesty, even when the news is bad. The press release had gone out at 9 a.m., a comprehensive statement detailing the fraud discovered at Pinnacle Technologies, the immediate steps taken to address it, and the company's commitment to strengthened financial controls moving forward. My name had been mentioned only once, as a security consultant assisting with the investigation. Exactly as I'd requested. And the board's decision about my proposal? I asked, moving to the home office where Michael had once practiced presentations late into the night. Approved without hesitation, Douglas confirmed. Harrington Security Consulting has a 1-year contract to overhaul our entire financial security infrastructure. The paperwork will be ready for your signature tomorrow. My first major client, a 7-figure contract that would establish my new firm's reputation immediately. Not because I had been Michael Coleman's wife, but because I had been the one to expose and help correct a massive fraud. Thank you, Douglas, I said sincerely, for believing me from the beginning. Thank me by keeping us from ever facing this kind of situation again, he replied. Oh, and Claire? The retention bonus for key staff members was approved as well. The employees who might have been collateral damage in all this will be protected. That had been my personal priority, ensuring that the rank-and-file employees at Pinnacle wouldn't suffer for their CEO's crimes. The retirement accounts Michael had been slowly draining would be restored from the company's insurance policy. After ending the call, I sat at the desk that had once been Michael's domain. On it lay the morning's newspaper, open to the business section where his downfall was front-page news. Pinnacle CEO charged in $7.4 embezzlement scheme. The article detailed the months-long investigation that had uncovered the fraud, the pending criminal charges, and the company's swift response. What the article didn't mention, couldn't know, was the personal betrayal that had triggered it all. How Michael had planned to discard me with the same callous efficiency he applied to outdated technology. How he'd brought his mistress to our anniversary dinner as the final humiliation before moving on with his upgraded life. My phone chimed with a text message from Agent Rivera. Plea deal discussions starting tomorrow. His attorneys are pushing for minimum security, but prosecutor isn't budging on financial restitution. Thought you'd want to know. I appreciated her keeping me informed, though I had deliberately distanced myself from the criminal proceedings. My role had been to expose the fraud and protect the company. The justice system would handle the rest. Michael would likely serve time, not as much as his crimes warranted, but enough to destroy the carefully cultivated image he valued above all else. As for Veronica, or whatever her real name was, she had already turned on Michael, offering full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. Survival instinct at its most predictable. According to Agent Kalman, she was providing detailed testimony about similar schemes at other companies, potentially solving several open fraud cases. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the security monitor, I saw a delivery person holding a large arrangement of white lilies. My favorite flowers, though not the ones Michael had routinely ordered for our anniversary, preferring more dramatic red roses that photographed better for social media. I accepted the delivery, surprised to find the card signed by the staff at Ciel. With our compliments and admiration, your strength has inspired us all. The gesture touched me unexpectedly. Throughout the investigation, I had maintained professional detachment, focusing on evidence and outcomes rather than emotions. But this simple acknowledgement of the personal courage required to expose Michael's crimes and endure his public betrayal brought the first tears I had allowed myself in months. I placed the flowers on the kitchen island and made myself a cup of tea, planning the day ahead. My new offices downtown would be ready next week. The team I'd assembled, Former colleagues with complementary skills in digital forensics, financial investigation, and corporate compliance would start on Monday. Life was moving forward with purpose and momentum. My personal phone rang. The one only close friends and family had the number for. It was Sarah, my younger sister who lived across the country. "Tell me you've seen it," she said without greeting. "Seen what?" "The video. From Ciel. It's everywhere." My stomach tightened. "What video?" "From your anniversary dinner. Someone leaked the security footage of Michael being confronted by the federal agents. It's got millions of views already. People are calling you the Anniversary Avenger." I closed my eyes briefly. This was exactly what I hadn't wanted. The personal aspect of the case overshadowing the professional investigation, turning a serious financial crimes case into social media entertainment. "I'll call you back," I told Sarah, ending the call and immediately dialing Henri at Ciel. "Madam Harrington," he answered, sounding deeply apologetic. "I was just about to call you. This unauthorized release was not from our establishment, I assure you. We believe one of the federal agents may have accessed our security system remotely." "It's not your fault, Henri," I interrupted. "But I need damage control. Now." "Of course," he agreed quickly. "What can we do?" I considered the options. The footage couldn't be erased. Once something entered the digital realm, containment became nearly impossible. But the narrative could still be shaped. "Release a statement emphasizing the professional nature of the investigation," I directed. "Mention my background in corporate security and the serious nature of the financial crimes uncovered. No comment on personal relationships or the timing of the confrontation. Immediately," Henri promised. "And Madam Harrington? For what it's worth, the public response has been overwhelmingly supportive of you." After ending the call, I searched for the video online, finding it quickly on several news sites and social platforms. The footage showed exactly what I remembered: Michael and Veronica being approached by agents Kalman and Rivera, their shocked expressions as they were escorted from the restaurant. What it couldn't capture was the months of careful investigation that had preceded that moment, or the complex emotions beneath my composed exterior. The comments section overflowed with reactions. "Queen behavior. Took down her cheating husband and his corporate fraud. Can we talk about how calm she stays the whole time? Ice cold. Imagine bringing your mistress to your anniversary dinner only to get arrested for fraud. Han karma." I closed the browser, oddly, unmoved by the public's fascination with what they perceived as a revenge story. They saw only the culmination, the successful CEO brought down by the wife he'd underestimated. They couldn't know the professional dilemma I'd faced when personal betrayal and corporate crime had intersected, or the careful ethical line I'd walked while building the case. My work phone rang, a New York number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. "Claire Harrington speaking." "Ms. Harrington, this is Eliza Montgomery with the Wall Street Journal. We're working on a feature about corporate security and fraud prevention in the wake of the Pinnacle Technologies case. Given your central role in uncovering the fraud, we'd love to interview you about your methodology and background." This was unexpected. Professional recognition rather than tabloid interest in the personal drama. "I'd be willing to discuss the security aspects of the case," I said carefully, "with the understanding that I won't comment on personal matters or ongoing legal proceedings." "Completely understood," Eliza assured me. "We're interested in your expertise in identifying financial vulnerabilities and building fraud cases. Your work on this has been described by the SEC as exemplary and instrumental. This could be an opportunity to shape the conversation toward the professional rather than the personal." She was right. While I couldn't control the social media narrative about the Anniversary Avenger, I could establish my professional reputation through serious journalism. Harrington Security Consulting would benefit from the exposure, and more importantly, other companies might strengthen their financial controls after reading about how easily Michael had manipulated Pinnacle's systems. "I'll do it," I decided. But I'd like to include Thomas Liu in the interview as well. His perspective as the executive who was being set up to take the fall is valuable. Perfect, Eliza agreed. That adds another important dimension to the story. As we scheduled the interview for the following week, I moved through the house opening windows, letting fresh air sweep through rooms that had felt stagnant for too long. In the kitchen, I found Michael's favorite coffee mug still in the cabinet, an EI, oversight by the movers. I considered keeping it as some sort of trophy, but instead dropped it into the donation box by the door. No mementos needed. The doorbell rang again. This time, the security monitor showed Rachel, my oldest friend who had stood by me throughout the investigation, offering support without judgment. "I brought lunch," she announced when I opened the door, holding up bags from our favorite cafe. "And champagne, because some things deserve celebrating." "My professional vindication or my personal humiliation going viral?" I asked dryly, leading her to the kitchen. "Neither," Rachel replied, setting down the food and extracting a bottle of Veuve Clicquot. "We're celebrating you reclaiming your life. On your terms." As she poured 2 glasses, I realized she was right. Despite the public spectacle, despite the unintended social media fame, what mattered was that I had refused to be the victim in Michael's narrative. I had used my skills and strength to expose the truth, protect innocent colleagues, and forge a new path forward. "To new beginnings," Rachel offered, raising her glass. "To new beginnings," I agreed, the phrase echoing my toast at Ciel 3 weeks ago, but with an entirely different meaning now. Outside, a moving truck pulled up, this one bringing my personal belongings from storage. Items I'd collected before meeting Michael, pieces that reflected my taste rather than his, books and art that represented who I had been and who I was becoming again. As Rachel and I watched the movers unload the first boxes, my phone chimed with an email notification. It was from Douglas, a news alert about Michael's attorneys requesting a change of venue for his trial, claiming he couldn't receive a fair hearing due to media attention. Request denied. "He still doesn't get it, does he?" Rachel observed, reading over my shoulder. "Still trying to control the narrative, manipulate the situation." "Some people never change," I replied, putting down my phone and picking up my champagne again. But I did. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the empty spaces that would soon be filled with my chosen belongings, my new life, my reclaimed identity. Michael had brought his lover to our anniversary dinner and called her an upgrade, never imagining that the true transformation would be mine. He had tried to write my ending. Instead, he had only set the stage for my new beginning.